Do you need to expand it or? Ready? Ciao everybody, it's Joan coming today from Joan's Kitchen, and today we are going to be baking pesto. Pesto is either a dish or really it's kind of a sauce that's made from fresh basil, fresh garlic, nuts, cheese, and olive oil. And it's originated in Italy, and I'm going to get started. It's a great dish for this time of year because typically fresh basil is very abundant. You can get it at the farmer's market, you may be growing it at home, you can get it in the supermarket, and it's a delicious, tasty dish that's not hard to prepare. And as always, if anybody has any questions, please ask me, and I will see if I can answer them during the live broadcast, or if not, I will answer them if you just put it in the comment later on. I will get back to you. This is a dish that's from Italy, which is really one of my very favorite destinations, and I can't wait to get back to Italy. So the main ingredient in the pesto I'm preparing today is fresh basil. Basil is, I guess it's an herb that grows. We believe that it originated in India, but where it's really flourished and taken home is in the Liguria province of Italy, as well as Provence in France. We also have nuts. The traditional pesto has pine nuts, but the recipe that I'm using calls for walnuts, so I'm using walnuts today. It also has fresh garlic. I've got a whole head of garlic here. I won't be using the whole head. This recipe calls for a little bit of cream cheese in it, like this, and we also have some olive oil in it, and then I'm going to be using this today to put on pasta. So the word pesto means pounded, and so the original pesto was made using a mortar and pestle, so the leaves and the nuts and the garlic would be actually pounded together in a mortar and pestle. I've never actually made it that way. For me, this is one of these dishes where having a food processor really comes in handy. And I've got my basil leaves here that I've already cleaned. For this particular recipe, you don't want to use the stems of the basil, you only want to use the leaves. My sense is that the stems have a little bit more bitterness in them, while the leaves are really sweet. So we're going to go ahead and put our leaves into the bowl of the food processor. And we're also going to be putting in the garlic. I've got 5 cloves of garlic that are chopped, or that peeled over here. And we are going to put our nuts in there. So my walnuts are in there, my garlic, and my pesto. And we're going to go ahead and process that into a paste. And I do this by pulsing the food processor because I don't really want to over process it. So I'm kind of watching what I'm doing here to make sure that it doesn't get too much over processed. And I'm going to go ahead and add my olive oil in there, which I've also got measured out. And the olive oil for this recipe is divided in 2 because part of it you're going to be using when you're actually heating the pesto up. So I'm adding my olive oil in there. And I'm going to process this until it's a paste. I've got my spatula here. I'm just going to wipe the sides down. If you don't want to use this right away, if you want to put it in the freezer, this is actually the point that you would freeze it before adding the cheese. And personally, especially when I lived in Chicago, I loved having some pesto in the freezer. It was so nice to pull it out on a cold winter night and have that little taste of summertime. Okay, I'm going to grind it up a little bit more because I can still see the nuts a little bit, and I'm going to try to hold this up so you can see. The nuts are a little bit too chunky for me. I want it to be really more of a paste and not this chunky. So I'm going to process it just a little bit more. And this combination of the pesto, the basil and the nuts and the garlic and the olive oil is going to be cooked down a little bit. Scrape it down one more time. So pesto, we believe it was invented, the modern pesto, in the province of Genoa in Italy in the mid-1800s. So typically it's called pesto alla genovese. And pesto, as I mentioned, the word just means pounded. So really any kind of a combination of a fresh herb leaf and garlic and nuts, maybe a little olive oil and cheese, could be considered a pesto. In some places, a pesto is made with almonds. It might be made with mint. a lot of times now you see pesto that's made with spinach and with arugula. I just love the flavor of basil, and to me this is just really a classic flavoring, and it's so good with pasta. It's also really good if you pair it with some kinds of meat or fish. It's good with pork, it's good with scallops, it's good with fish. It's just a really nice versatile sauce. In France, they call it Pesto, P-I-S-T-O-U, which also means pounded. And in France, they make a potato salad where it's a pesto dressing, so it's more of an oily dressing, and it's typically served with boiled potatoes and green beans. I'm going to give this one more spin here. Does anybody have any questions while you're watching this? No? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer my pesto, my paste, into my little saucepan here. And this is going to get heated. I don't like to heat it too much because I like to kind of keep the fresh green color. And there's garlic in here, but I actually kind of like the strong flavor of the garlic when it's more raw. So I really try to not overheat it too much. So at this point, we're going to be adding our Parmesan cheese and a little bit more olive oil, and we're going to be adding our cream cheese to it. The cream cheese is an Americanization of the ingredients, but I think that it is really helpful to it. It's just a little bit of cream cheese, just about a tablespoon. And you talk about a recipe source. This is a recipe that was actually in Sports Illustrated in the 80s. This is a recipe that came from the wife of the baseball player from the Boston Red Sox named Dewey Evans. And he used to supposedly eat this pesto every day before he had a baseball game. I don't know if that's true or not, or if it's urban legend. I've also pre-cooked my pasta. Today I'm using bow tie pasta. It's a little pasta that's shaped like a little tiny bow tie, and that's kind of a traditional pasta shape to be tossed with the pesto. One of the things that you want to do when you're cooking pasta for really any kind of sauce is don't drain out all the pasta water, because that's something that you can use to kind of loosen or lighten up the sauce. So I'm going to go ahead here and get this on my little burner. Turn this guy on. I'm going to go ahead and add my cream cheese in there. And my olive oil. And I have some ground Parmesan cheese. I don't think I mentioned that at the beginning with the ingredients. This also calls for a hard cheese. You can use Parmesan or you can use Pecorino. I prefer Parmesan. I'm not a big sheep milk cheese fan. And Pecorino is a sheep milk cheese, so I use this. You can also use Romano, which I think is also a sheep milk cheese. But those are all variations that you can use to put in here. And where did I put my spatula? Use this instead. So I'm just going to be stirring this around, and once it starts to kind of melt together, I'm going to lift it up so you can see. But basically what we're trying to do is get this Parmesan cheese kind of melted a little bit into the pesto sauce. And it's starting to come together a little bit, but it's really like kind of a thick paste, even thicker than peanut butter. And that's where we're going to see how adding the hot water that we cooked the pasta in is going to be helpful to the process.
Are the pine nuts really?
I'm not using pine nuts today, I'm using walnuts, but pine nuts are nuts. Pine nuts are pretty interesting. Pine nuts are really from a pine tree. And if you ever see like big huge pine cones, sometimes there's little things on the inside that are covered with a shell. They look almost like a little tiny Brazil nut, and the shell is really hard and it has to be cracked open to get the nut out. And then the nut is really, really tiny. Pine nuts are very flavorful. They have a lot of oil in them, and the reason that they're so expensive is how they're harvested. And pine nuts, like any nut, they really benefit from being toasted a little bit. It really brings out the flavor. So this is bubbling away. My cheese is starting to melt, and I also have my pasta water going because I've pre-cooked my pasta and I'm going to heat it up quickly before putting it in here. This is coming together just fine. You can see that the Parmesan cheese is starting to get like a little bit melty, and it's steaming. It's starting to come together, and I'm going to go ahead and add some hot water in here to loosen up the sauce a little bit. And I'm going to reheat my pasta really quickly. Just to get it loose and hot again. So I've kept the water boiling over on the stove. And you'll see, as I mentioned, rather than dumping out all the pasta, I'm using what's called a spider to get the pasta out of the pasta dish. So I'm going to give it a quick stir here. Just to make sure that it's hot. And this is kind of bubbling away here. It's really starting to come together. The oil is helping to mix together. I'm going to show you this real quickly. I'm going to turn my heat off here. But this is what it looks like right now. So you can see little strings of the Parmesan cheese in there. And I'm going to go ahead and start with about a half a cup of water out of the pasta pan, the hot water. And put that in here to kind of loosen it up. I think it really helps make the sauce be more creamy. You know, if you've ever had pesto, sometimes it's kind of hard to get it to get distributed evenly among your pasta. So I want to show you the difference in consistency. I've just added about a half a cup of water. I think I'm going to add another cup of hot water to make it even a little bit creamier. You can do this with any kind of pasta sauce. If you're using bottled tomato sauce, you probably don't need to, but if you've made your own, you may want to because it might be kind of thick and chunky. And even with an Alfredo sauce, which has a lot of cream and butter and cheese, if it's too thick, you can lighten it up by using a little bit of the water that you boil the pasta in. So now, I'm going to try to hold this up so you can see, but it has a much more liquid consistency, so that should be much easier to spread on the pasta. So I'm going to go ahead and fish my hot pasta out of the water here. I have a colander already set up in the sink to drain it. At this point, actually, I could dump the pasta water because I've already gotten out my cup of water that I've added into the sauce. Okay, I think that's all of it. So I'm just going to give this a shake and put it into my dish here. And I'm going to go ahead and give this a final stir before I add it onto my pasta. So you can see the consistency of it as it's pouring. It's thinner than a ketchup. It's probably the consistency of like a cream soup or maybe a thin gravy. It's got a lovely aroma. As I mentioned, if you were going to freeze this, what you would want to do would be to take it just through the stage where you've mixed together the olive oil, the basil leaves, the garlic, and the nuts. And then go ahead and freeze that, probably like in a little glass or Tupperware dish, something like that, and put a thin film of olive oil over it and freeze it. It'll keep that way in the freezer for months. And as I mentioned, it's really nice to pop it out of the freezer in the wintertime. I mentioned at the beginning that the word pesto comes from the word pounded. And if you want to see a lovely demonstration of pesto made in the traditional way, I highly recommend watching the Netflix special Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, which was released, I think, last year by a chef named Samin Nosrat. She's a chef who worked for many years at Chez Panisse in Berkeley. And she did trips around the world, so it's a great travel show too, where she learned about cooking with the elements of salt and fat and acid and heat. The fat episode takes place in Italy, and she has a whole section on an Italian grandmother making basil pesto by hand with a mortar and pestle, and it's just like such a loving portrayal of it, and it looks so delicious and smooth and silky. Personally, I've not tried that myself, but one of these days I may. And I want to show you the finished dish here. These are the bow tie pastas that I have tossed with the pesto. It's hot right now. It's delicious hot with just a little bit of salt and pepper on it. It's also actually good cold too, like as a pasta salad. So for today, that is our lesson on pesto. Does anybody have any other questions before I sign off here? And if not, I'm going to say ciao for now, and I will see you again next week. I hope you enjoyed the cooking lesson today. Thank you.